Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 69 of the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. I'm going to riff on one of my favorite Bryan Adams songs, The Summer of '69, because in this particular episode, I'm going to look back at an article I had published predicting something about the future of publishing back in the summer of 2009. And yes, be warned, there may be Mark singing later on in this podcast. Don't say I didn't warn you. But before we get to the main content of this, I want to share a word from this episode's sponsor, Findaway Voices. If you're interested in how you can take advantage of publishing your audiobooks as an independent author, you should really check out Findaway Voices. You can use Findaway Voices to distribute your audiobooks to the broadest global market of audiobook retailers and library systems. And you'd be surprised at where you sell. If I take a look at my 2019 sales through Findaway Voices so far this year, and I'm recording this at the very end of March 2019, I see that I've earned income from Findaway Voices from the following places: Bountiful, HiBooks, Biblioteca, and Authors Direct. Now, Authors Direct is currently in limited release, but it is an opportunity where people are buying the books directly off of my own website at markleslie.ca, and that is powered by Findaway Voices. The thing that surprises me is I am earning sales through Audible/ACX and the other platforms, but the majority of my income from Findaway Voices so far has been coming from platforms that I don't even pay any attention to or do any marketing on. And that's the kind of income I enjoy making. So if you're curious to see how you can take advantage of all the great opportunities for audio through Findaway Voices, check them out at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. It is so funny how things just happen. Earlier today, I was taking a look at some sales, and on my Kindle dashboard, it said that yesterday I had had a sale of one of my other books. This means one of the books that doesn't really get a lot of action. And I found that on that day, I'd sold Killing It on Kobo. I'd sold a 7 Ps of publishing. I'd sold a couple of my fiction titles, had some downloads of some other titles. And then I had a single copy sale of a book called Living at the Tip. Now, Living at the Tip was a book that I put out very, very quickly. I remember it was in 2011, and I was sitting in the Kobo office. I think it was, it must have been November 2011. And Kindle Direct Publishing announced a new program called KDP Select. Now, KDP Select was and is an exclusivity program where if you lock yourself into 90 days of exclusivity on your ebook so that the ebook is only available on Amazon Kindle, you get access to additional features, such as being able to make your book free for 5 whole days in that 90-day period, or entering it into a Kindle Countdown deal. Later on, they added Kindle Unlimited Reads. So when they added the Kindle Unlimited program, when your book is locked into a KDP Select as exclusive to Amazon, Kindle Unlimited readers have access to read your book for free, and then you get paid based on page reads. And that is usually where the KDP Select program really launched for a lot of authors who do make good money under the program. But as I was saying, I was sitting in the Kobo office. We had launched Kobo Writing Life, where we were in the process of launching, because I believe it was the fall of 2011. I joined Kobo in the fall of 2011, in October, and we didn't launch Kobo Writing Life until 2012. So I was still in the process of building what Kobo was going to have as its self-publishing solution. And I got the email from Kindle Publishing. I checked it and I said, oh my God, there's an exclusivity program. I said, well, because I'm always one to experiment, I better publish something to it so I can understand this from the inside out. How is this going to affect us? How can Kobo compete with a program like this, etc.? So I had already had a bunch of things published, and I didn't really have anything. So I took a look at some articles I had previously written for an online magazine and collected them. I thought, okay, I have access to them. The rights are still mine because it was a free magazine. And so what I can do is I can take these, I can collect them, and I can release books. So a bit of a background on the magazine. The magazine, it was called The Mark News. No relation to my name. It was just called The Mark News. And it might have been a precursor to something like Medium or whatever, where people wrote articles on all kinds of different topics. It was a general interest one. And of course, they had different columns and they had different columnists. So they were trying to get experts in the field to write different things. So they initially had contacted me in 2009. This was when I had been making the rounds as a print-on-demand advocate with the Espresso Book Machine and doing stuff like that. And I also was on the board of directors for the Canadian Booksellers Association. I hadn't yet become president yet, I don't believe. I don't know, it was a long time ago. It's hard to remember. But they had asked me to write a series of articles regarding my perspective about various happenings and developments in the book industry, in bookselling, and in the publishing industry. So I thought it would be fun to collect these together and put it into the book. And I very quickly released it. I used Kindle's free cover conversion, the free cover generation. I just wanted to have a book in the program. This book, Living at the Tip, has the subtitle, Navigating the Digital Tipping Point of the Book World, collected articles by Mark Leslie Lefebvre. And again, this was around the time when this book came out. We were just at the major digital tipping point, and I wanted to explore that. Of course, the evolution of bookselling and the evolution of publishing has long been a fascination of mine. But what I thought was interesting is that this one particular article that I'm going to share with you, which was initially written in the summer of 2009, almost 10 years ago, I thought since this was the 69th episode, I would riff on the old Bryan Adams song, The Summer of '69, and I would share my perspective when I was asked to look into the future and what might change, what might be dead, what might not exist 10 years from now. And I find it fascinating. One of my pet peeves in the industry, and even in the early days of ebooks, was related to territorial publishing rights. And territorial publishing rights, which is kind of like the old boys publishing, because this is where the right sales at places like Frankfurt Book Fair and the Book Expo America and Salon de Livre in France, this is where a lot of these sales of rights happen, where an agent has the rights to a book and then tries to get as much money as possible by selling the rights to a U.S. publisher and then selling separate rights to a Canadian publisher, selling separate rights to a U.K. publisher, and then maybe they still have other rights that they may want to sell through a third publisher that does distribution in different countries. Because again, this is based on the physical distribution model where there are distribution warehouses in different countries, and local publishers or local distributors will invest money in books in those territories. Now, that makes complete sense in the paper world, and it makes complete sense in the agent world, where agents keep, typically 15%. They make more money if they can divide it up. So if Random House, for example, were to try to get together to buy the rights for Canada, the US, Australia, UK, New Zealand, for example, like the major English language territories, that might be like one lump sum, but if they split it off and they sell it 5 different times, they may be able to make more. Maybe different than when you sell a box set for $9.99 or higher, ideally, because you're not stupid and you're not publishing it only on Kindle, that you're actually publishing the big giant value set for $15, $16, $19, so they can get all your books for a cheaper price. That's still a discount for the reader. But having that bundle at a certain price or selling them all individually, which is where you potentially make more. But those are some of the reasons why territorial publishing rights exist in the print world of publishing. When it comes to digital, there's a bit of a difference because There is no need for somebody to import books to store them in a warehouse on the north of the 49th parallel, for example, like to have a Canadian warehouse. So Canadian bookstores can order the book from the warehouse in Markham or the warehouse on the West Coast, or even more expensively, having a warehouse in Australia for books that were imported from the UK, from the US, etc. So a lot of the issues in the publishing industry related to territorial rights are kind of dispelled or are not an issue when it comes to digital, because with digital, you can publish globally. Now, when you are publishing your book directly to Amazon via KDP, or you're using Kobo Writing Life, for example, to publish directly to Kobo, when you go to the rights screen, you can actually see that by default, when you go to publish, it assumes world rights. It assumes you have the rights for this book in all territories, and that's usually the default status that most self-published people go through. However, if you are a hybrid author or if you sold rights to a different market, you do have the ability to deselect global distribution or worldwide distribution, and you have the ability to go in and manually select that. Now, this is a tool that exists on Draft to Digital, for example, as well, and I've actually had this done before I started working with Draft to Digital, because I'd helped some friends who had used that to publish outside of Kindle and Kobo, for example. And they do have the means, because when they send your ebook to a retailer, they actually specify the territorial rights. Now, by default, it is world rights, but you can actually manually request that they remove certain territories, which may be the case if you've sold North American rights and you just want to use them to get your book everywhere. Now, the first time we really did a lot with this was when I was working with my buddy Kevin J. Anderson, and he had sold North American rights to Kensington on a mass market series, the Dan Shambles Zombie PI series, but they had only bought North American rights, and Kevin has readers in hundreds of countries around the world. So what Kevin did is he commissioned his own version of the cover, and then he used these platforms to get that same book out into the markets it was available through Europe, for example. So his fans across Europe could read the new series. Now, my good buddy in Canada here, Robert J. Sawyer, did that as well when he sold the rights to Quantum Night. Only Random House Canada bought it, so they bought the rights to the ebook and to the hardcover. And same thing in the US. Random House US bought the hardcover and the ebook rights. So Rob ended up splitting the rights and creating an ebook version for everywhere else, and he used Kindle and Kobo and Draft to Digital to get it into the rest of the world. He actually ended up selling more copies of the ebook than were sold through the traditional model. Well, one of the reasons was because the publisher was selling the ebook for $14.99 and he was selling it for $5. So he sold way more copies of the ebook and obviously kept 70% of that. So he made a lot more money off of the ebook than he would have ever seen from the publisher, even though he did get a decent advance. That's mostly because the publisher does a really, really good job of getting those books distributed into bookstores, and that's the primary market for most print book publishers, which is why territorial rights still exist. But what you're going to hear in this article that I'm going to read, which is from Living at the Tip, is my perspective back in the early days of when the ebook boom was just starting. The early days, 2009, my speculation about digital territorial rights. Now, one of the things that prompted this was I remember I was traveling, I was wanting to read one of the Harry Potter books, and I didn't want to get on a plane with a 600-page hardcover because it was just too bulky. I wanted to have something thin. I was listening to audiobooks back then. I was starting to read ebooks. I believe I was reading ebooks on a Sony PSR 505 reader way back then. And I couldn't get Harry Potter in ebook legally back then. I just wanted to buy the audiobook, which didn't exist. I just wanted to buy a legal version of the ebook, which didn't exist. So I was frustrated over territorial rights. Now, I know with Harry Potter, for example, it was published by the UK initially, and then a different distributor in Canada bought the rights, and a different distributor, I believe Scholastic bought the rights in the US, and Raincoast in Canada bought the rights. So the rights were split up. I mean, J.K. Rowling made a lot of money took her time, did something really, really smart when she created Pottermore, who still own the ebook rights to all of those books. And that's probably how the audiobooks have been released, is probably through that entity. So, I mean, it worked out really, really well. But at the time, I was really, really frustrated because I could easily get my hands on illegal copies, but I did not want to. I wanted to support the industry. And that's one of the things that sort of led to this frustration. The other thing was just considering how easy digital could be, because I had been doing stuff with print on demand and making books available around the world through print on demand with the rights, as opposed to just saying, oh no, that book's not available for sale in this country. I realized that with ebooks beginning to take hold back in 2009, that saying this book is not available in this country just doesn't make sense in the digital format. Now that's changed a little bit because of the way that Apple and Kobo and Kindle and Google, for example, are available in so many countries around the world. And there are other places like StreetLib and Publish Drive that work with publishers in Europe and in Asia and stuff like that, or with retailers, I should say, in those countries. There is a lot less territorial restriction than there used to be. But again, I was back in 2009 when I wrote this, and I thought it would be intriguing to share it here with you so you can get a perspective of things I was thinking about and worrying about and speculating about almost a full 10 years ago. That was back in the summer of 2009.
I had my first prediction, sent it to a friend of mine. Was talking about publishing back in the summer of 2009.
Territorial Publishing Rights by Mark Leslie Lefebvre. From a series, 12 Things That Will Be Obsolete in 10 Years, first published in the Mark News website, July 19th, 2010. As much as I hate speculating on what might be obsolete in the near future, there are some things I believe should die so that an industry might be saved from extinction. Ever try to purchase an ebook only to discover it's not available in your geographic area? I would hope that in another 10 years, territorial restrictions on digital goods, aka artificial borders based on physical distribution models from decades ago, will cease to exist. To understand why artificial borders exist requires a look back on why territorial restrictions were created in the first place. And while this article focuses on the publishing industry and books in general, it might apply to other markets. Back when the only option was physical delivery of books, language barrier issues aside, it made sense for various market forces to purchase and secure distribution rights within particular geographic regions. Despite all three being English language markets, for example, there will often be a Canadian, a US, and a UK edition of the exact same book. One thing this approach allows for is subtle changes in marketing, cover design, and format. For example, Lawrence Hill's best-selling novel, published by HarperCollins in Canada as The Book of Negroes, is published in the US, Australia, and New Zealand as Someone Knows My Name. The title change is based on an understanding of the subtle differences in the markets. In this case, an appeal to an audience that wouldn't accept Negroes in the title. Each territory has not only a marketing department and physical distribution system in place, but also a sales force that adds a similar value based on the uniqueness and critical understanding of the market. In a nutshell, then, territorial rights represent significant real-world costs and investments. Thus, consumers are restricted to purchasing items within their own territories in order to ensure compensation for those investment costs. With the advent of digital books, however, the same territorial restrictions exist despite the fact that digital distribution typically involves a significant reduction in those costs. Instead of reimagining a cost-effective manner of digital distribution that allows customers to purchase the item regardless of their geographic location, and for the originating content owners and curators to be fairly compensated, in many cases, these restrictions limit the ability to sell ebooks that people want to buy. While it makes sense that authors, agents, publishers, distributors, and retailers should be compensated for sales, it doesn't make sense to restrict a customer from being able to trade money for a digital good, particularly when it's based on last century's distribution model. If you want to make it easier for a customer to steal a digital file than to purchase one, that's what people will do. And let's be honest, titles are far easier to access via illegal file sharing sites than through the current legal and legitimate distribution models that exist. So, this speculation on a trend/practice that is going to become obsolete is based on my desire to see an industry evolve and adapt so it can continue to exist. Because whether I'm buying the printed version or the ebook version, as a consumer and book lover, I just want to be able to do it easily and legally so I can enjoy reading and support an industry that gives this reader so much. So there you have an article that shows the things I was reflecting on back in the summer of 2009 when I was thinking about territorial restrictions in a digital world. 10 years have passed. A decade has passed since I was speculating about that. And I was showing my frustration with the borders that existed because they were all based on the print world. And although not much has changed in terms of the way that the industry itself works, what has changed dramatically, particularly in those 10 years, has been how independent authors and even small publishers have been able to take advantage of digital in bold and exciting new ways. I already talked about how you can use rights splitting as an author if you sell some of your rights to a publisher and you can divvy up those rights. That's a really important element in successful author activities today, is looking at each of their rights and the different IPs. So you've got, hardcover rights and mass market rights and different styles of audiobook rights and ebook rights, and where are those rights sold? There's so many layers to the complexity of this. It is interesting how much has changed in 10 years, and it's also interesting to see what hasn't changed. And the biggest amount of change, of course, has happened in the independent author community. And this is kind of an interesting thing to reflect on because, as I said here, in 2019, I wonder what changes might be coming in terms of publishing and writing and digital and opportunities for writers in the next 10 years. And when you look at what has happened in just the past 10 years, it blows my mind to consider what could happen. What are those changes? Back in 2009 was just the beginning of what they consider the gold rush era. 2009 through 2012 was the really giant growth spurt period, and seeing triple-digit growth year over year. Now I always reflect back to something that Michael Serbenis, who's the original CEO of Kobo, what he used to say. He used to say that we're at the very beginning of a 20-year transformation of the publishing industry. And when you look at it, I think we are still at the very beginning of it. Most people who have read a book have still not read an ebook. Go check it. Among people that you randomly poll in public, not at a writer's conference or something like that where people are all in the know, but the average person who reads a book, if you bump into them like at the bus station or a subway station or train station or something like that, or an airport, and you say, have you read a book in the last year? Yes, I've read a book in the last year. What format did you read? Chances are you're going to find that more people are still reading in paperback, or print, I should say, rather than in digital formats. So the growth of ebooks, the growth of audio, we're still at the very tipping point. And funny, 10 years ago, I thought we were at the digital tipping point. But apparently when you look at the grand scheme of the legacy of publishing, when you go back to Scrolls and Gutenberg and all the things that have happened over the hundreds and hundreds of years, this era, which seems like so much is going on, the tipping point, the point itself could be a 20-year period. So there we are. This is the special episode 69. That was the year I was born. That was the year Bryan Adams sang about. And of course, I adapted that into thinking about some of my own reflections back from the summer of 2009. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Stark Reflections podcast. I want to give a quick shout out to all the wonderful patrons who support the podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections. Thanks for taking the time for supporting me. I want to put a call out to the patrons. Now, because I did some singing in this episode, would it be a fair thing to offer patrons a Mark song-free version, meaning a version of the same podcast available for patrons where I do not sing. Would that be a treat for you? Probably would be. But in any case, thanks so much for being patrons. Thank you so much for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. I hope you found some valuable reflections about the publishing industry and about territorial rights in this issue. I look forward to hanging out with you again next week in episode 70. But until then, here's wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Those were the book days of my life. Oh yeah, back in the summer of 2009.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.